afternoon and welcome back to the stream. I hope you're doing well. Today we're live with some messed it up right from the get-go. Some world building, and this week with a schedule as well. I know I try to be pretty consistent with what time I stream anyway, but I figured with how I've got things kind of sorted out at the moment and planned out, I might as well try sticking to a schedule, so I've got that up on Twitter. Hopefully that will let people choose a bit more and know ahead of time what streams to show up for, depending on what they're interested in. I try to make my streams kind of interesting for everyone from all perspectives, to tie all the different bits together, because, you know, I like strategy games and resource management games and stuff like that, and I like writing and world building, but I think there's a lot of overlap between those, especially when we're playing, you know, EU4 with the Ambina mod, and there's all that story and lore and stuff to be looked at. But today, no games, a pure world building stream. I have been thinking recently about a lot of different world building things, but in particular, a few of the things I've been reading have gotten me thinking about horror. And because I read mostly web serials, so I'm over on Royal Road reading lit RPG and progression fantasy and stuff like that, I've been thinking about the intersection between those genres, because horror is kind of a genre that thrives on some very specific things. There's a few subgenres of horror, but generally speaking, you know, horror is about being horrified, so there's a big aspect on fear. Fear of danger, fear of the unknown, etc., stuff like that. Fear of pain with lots of slashes and gore and stuff like that. And progression fantasy is, to some extent, antithetical to that. Like, progression fantasy is all about the character gets stronger over time. They start off usually weak, sometimes at whatever given level of power, and we as the audience are there to watch them get stronger and stronger and stronger. And obviously as they get stronger, less and less is going to be a threat to them. Or to be a threat, the things have to be bigger and bigger. So how do we reconcile that with the tropes and requirements of horror? And that's what I want to look at today. So let me switch over to this. Yeah, I'm using Obsidian notes again. I've just kind of found it useful, so I want to keep going with that and see if it will help me keep things organized. So let me the whole idea. So to explore the sort of conundrum between horror and progression fantasy, feels like power creep is the most obvious answer, but it feels like it get boring. Hello Izzy, how are you doing today? Yeah, that's kind of the thing. So, progression fantasy, of course, addresses the issue of the character getting stronger by them facing bigger and bigger threats. But if you know the character's growing in power, and that they're always going to be getting stronger and fighting whatever they're up against, how do you manage to stay fearful? How do you introduce horror into that entire scenario? I'm good, you? Yeah, I'm well, thank you. Glad to hear it. Yeah, how do you get the audience to still feel the kind of emotions that horror is supposed to invoke? Now, I'm not a big horror aficionado myself. I pretty much don't read horror. The stuff that I read that gets close to horror, like some, like Catalepsis is a story I really enjoy, that's kind of eldritch sort of horror. There's all sorts of wizards going insane and cults happening and outer gods and stuff like that. I don't read that as a horror, you know? I read it as a progression fantasy. I read it to watch the main character get stronger and collect more girlfriends. That's kind of what that story is for me. I'm really not there for the fear factor. And outside of that, I'm always watching horror more for interest for it, you know? I don't even really watch horror movies. I watch this YouTube channel by a guy called Ryan Hollinger, who reviews and talks about horror movies because I love to hear about them, just not interested in watching them. I don't particularly get scared over horror movies. I can get jump scared in a horror game, you know, something, if you throw something in my face I will flinch. I think the only thing I can remember watching and getting really creeped out about was the Hannibal TV show. That was really good. A lot of atmosphere going on there. So maybe I'm not the ideal person to be talking about horror, but we're going to try it anyway. So the core idea, to explore this entire conundrum, I basically want to try world building a world that I might write a progression fantasy in with horror elements. For inspiration, I do very much enjoy the kind of SCP Foundation style. So there is an organization. They know about the supernatural threats. They try their best to deal with them and hail more than they succeed, I'd say. In a similar vein to the SCP Foundation, the Control video games. Again, this kind of very official bureau. How do you spell bureau? Very official kind of bureau / three-letter agency, that kind of thing. I think it's very cool. I think it always adds greatly to the feel of the entire thing. And for progression fantasy, and in terms of how Control works specifically, the agency has access to and uses supernatural powers. I think that's a pretty core aspect of how progression fantasy is going to work in this kind of setting. Right, like the main characters are going to be thwarting extra-dimensional threats and taking stuff from them along the way, whether it's artifacts or powers they themselves gain as they change over time. And that can be a kind of horror of its own, you know, the transformation into something you don't necessarily want to be. That's not necessarily something that I'm well suited to writing, because I adore the idea of transhumanism and becoming something else. You know, the whole, if you change in that way, will you even be human anymore? Like, first of all, yes I will, and secondly, even if not, who cares? As long as I'm still a person, it can still recognize me as myself. But that kind of, again, that doesn't mesh with horror. The horror is supposed to be you're scared of it, you don't want it, it's bull and unpleasant and stuff like that. I was recently watching the playthrough by Lane Lazar of what's the game called? Still Wakes the Deep, and that had some really cool body horror going on. Yeah, so the SCP Foundation Control, RimWorld Anomaly, the DLC. I don't play RimWorld much, but I do watch a YouTube channel that plays it exclusively, and Anomaly again really pulls on that kind of weird things show up and you want to try and subvert them and use them for your own ends, but also they're still very, very dangerous. So RimWorld, what does RimWorld contribute to the kind of core of this? We'll come back to it. Then Catalepsis. The main character in Catalepsis changes a lot over the course of the story, and she kind of becomes more eldritch and grapples with that over time. So the main character gains more traits and ways of thinking that resemble non-human things. Subnautica on the list too, maybe. I know Subnautica is considered a horror game by many because floating in the abyss of the oceans and hearing a thing in the distance and thinking, is that a shadow, is that movement over there, is very scary, but I don't count it as a horror game myself. I don't think it's trying to be. I know Subnautica is aware of the fear it can cause, and they certainly don't shy away from making use of it. You know, with the way the Leviathans can grab your little submersible and stuff like that. But I don't know if I count it as a horror game. And if I did, what would I take away from Subnautica here? So obviously, I mean, there's a few tropes in terms of like how it plays on fear of the unknown, of large, dangerous things, and then your relationship to the unknown and the horror in that game is fairly static, I think. You start off with only your like little handheld swimmer sister, and you've got to be careful of the fish that explode and those little sharks in the shallows. Then you get the... what's a submersible called? The... moth or something? The sea moth, I think. Yeah, the sea glide and then the sea moth, I think. And then basically just the fish that you're scared of get bigger, until eventually you've got your full-on U-boat. And I'm not even sure anything can attack the U-boat at that point. I'd say it's like the unknown, isolation, knowing other people have been there and failed. Yeah, that's something we can maybe draw from. Other people have been there and failed. I mean, we'll get to that next, I think. The what type of horror do I want it to be? Let's make a quick note. What type of horror? So we'll get that in a moment. I'm more thinking about the influences and aesthetics at the moment. I don't think Subnautica quite fits with the vision I've got. I mean, we'll draw from Subnautica and things like that because there's such a variety of things you can do in horror. But sort of aesthetic-wise, organizations that are very official and proper about it, and then kind of individuals just trying... I should put that in the RimWorld bit. Individuals with maybe too much power, just trying their best to make things work. So characters in Catalepsis, I mean, RimWorld will be down to how you play, but the characters in Catalepsis do find themselves going off the deep end and getting into a lot more trouble than they were prepared for quite often. It's a running theme that they sort one problem out, do something seemingly innocuous, and suddenly end up in so much more danger than they were ever prepared for. So we'll look into that kind of thing as well. Yeah, but overall, the two things I want, and this is less about, because the whole point of the exercise is I want to see can I bring these two things together in a satisfying way. So some of it is just going to come from, here's what I like to see in a horror and progression fantasy story. So progression fantasy wise, the main character will start from baseline human, and I don't want like full Eldritch God Ascension, so the ceiling for raw power is somewhere around, and where do we want it to be? Because it can, you put a fairly large amount of leeway in this kind of thing. If you read any of the Chronicles or World of Darkness stuff, for example, like Vampire the Masquerade or one of my favorites, Mage the Ascension, they have some super strong entities in that world. Some like rewrite the history of the world, reshape reality type wizards and vampires running around, and never mind the fae and the demons and everything else. But you can still play in that world and just kind of be a low-level guy or even a mid-level guy. But even if you get to the very highest levels, there's still horrible things running around, and if your powers go wrong and you're very, very strong, that just means the fallout is that much worse. So, how strong do I want them to be? I think I probably don't want to go full on can wipe out a city kind of strength. The ceiling for raw power is somewhere around can take on an organization single-handed. The MC will count as basically an entire department of their organization on their own at the top end. That's kind of how far I want them to grow. When they start off, they're just a grunt, and then over time they get more and more powers, more and more abilities, until at some point, what the organization would otherwise throw an entire team and resources and all sorts of nonsense at, they can just deploy this person and go, hey, here's a situation, this rival organization is trying to revive a god and end the world, go deal with it. Most of their growth... oh my gosh. I need to write. Most of their growth will... however... be horizontal. More variety and flexibility instead of more strength. And I read a lot of lit RPG and cultivation novels, and I very much enjoy how they do things in terms of breakpoints of power. There are certain stages someone reaches to, and when they manage to get past that bottleneck, they're suddenly a whole lot stronger. But we don't need to put that in the notes. Now, horror-wise, it gets a little bit more complicated. I think we might need to come down to the type of horror thing real quick. So, types of horror. And Izzy mentioned Subnautica. The unknown, isolation, no other people have been there and failed. So, the unknown. Let's just make a list real quickly. Real quick. Unknown. Mine started there for a second. The unknown. Isolation. Despair, I guess. Or the knowing other people have been there and failed. Then gore / fear of harm. The fear of the unknown, pretty universal. You can put that in really any genre and it will work. Isolation, yeah, they're part of an organization, so being cut off from the support network or resources. Despairing if it's possible, where others have failed. That also fits in quite well, because again they're in an organization, so there might be some threats that the organization has been facing for a long time. You can end up in the sort of scenario where if you've got a character who's built up to be the veteran, the reliable one, they've been around, they've seen it all, and then you run into a threat where suddenly they're terrified, then that's a great way to hype up whatever it is they're up against. You don't want to overdo it, because you then run into the Worf effect from Star Trek, where he's supposed to be the Klingon, the big strong physical guy, but he constantly gets beat up, because every time they want to introduce a threat, they have them put down the strongest guy to show how dangerous they are. So it's always Worf getting beat up. But that's definitely a possibility. It seems like a lot of the examples lean into cosmic horror tropes. Yes, definitely. Definitely. I just personally enjoy cosmic horror a lot more. Other types of horror, slasher and gore kind of movies, are just kind of fun to me. I don't particularly watch or read much horror, but you know, there's a horror movie that's supposed to be kind of comical called Cabin in the Woods, which I found great fun. That mostly played on gore and a few tropes. And then besides that, the kind of very personal, emotional horror movies, I think they're interesting. I don't think they resonate so much with me as entertainment, and I write more for entertainment than for deep introspection or that kind of thing. Maybe one of the types could be fear of the self-changing, like knowing you aren't who you used to be, and you don't know who or what you're becoming. Yeah, fear of losing who you are is definitely one. Do I want to feel that? The problem with that, and this is very much a know your audience kind of thing, there are few things that a lit RPG / progression / power fantasy audience hates more than a loss of character agency. So you have to be very careful how you write that. It is entirely doable. There are whole sections in Catalepsis where our main character grapples with trying to think about what they're becoming and what parts of themselves are still thinking on human logic and what's on eldritch logic. Or in Practical Guide to Evil, the main character also has a lot of struggles with trying to stay a regular mortal person, where she keeps getting more powerful and that power draws her into ways of thinking that she isn't used to, and changes who she is as a person. So that's definitely one to consider. I think if I lean into that personally, fear of losing who you are, rather than this eldritch thing is corrupting you, because I've never liked the whole power corrupts absolutely kind of line of thinking. If I were to go with that, I would probably lean more into you have options available to you now that you didn't before, and whether you choose to take those options and how you choose to interact with them could, like, it changes your relationship to the world inherently. You know, if you're suddenly powerful enough to just teleport in somewhere, crush all opposition, and make things go the way you want them to, are you going to be inclined to use that kind of power? To what extent? Who on? You know? You can lose how you are without it being part of the eldritch thing. That's not really a horror trope, I suppose, to that extent, at that point anymore. That's kind of more... I don't know what genre that falls into, but it shows up in other genres as well. Whereas the changed involuntarily kind of thing is a very specific horror thing. Both physical and mental changes. Yeah, so the unknown, isolation, despairing about whether you can succeed, the simple physical horror, fear of losing who you are. Yeah, so what I want to include, and how does it not... This is where we get to the crux of the issue. What do I want to put in there, and how do I stop it clashing with progression fantasy? Trying to think of the stuff I've read that's supposed to be horror and progression fantasy. The horror there often comes from the intrinsic horribleness of what's happening in the situation. Right? It's not horror in the sense of the character is particularly terrified, or horror in the sense of the audience is supposed to be getting scared by the proxy of, like, through the proxy of a character. It's horror in the sense of, like, oh, that person just got eaten and their soul is being used as fuel for this horrible machine. And, like, that's just kind of a thing you don't want to have happen to you. You know, it's... Progression fantasy horror is very different from, I think, any other more classical sort of horror, or more traditional sort of horror. And I think it could lean into the traditional tropes a little more to be a little more scary, you know? I just don't know how to do that. A lot of this exercise is going to be me challenging myself because, as I said, I'm not super huge into horror. I understand the appeal, I just don't feel it myself. So now I need to try and figure out how to make someone else feel the reaction that I don't feel myself. So horror-wise, what do I personally want in my stories? What do I want to see? I like monsters aesthetically. I think they're very, very cool a lot of the time. I think a lot of changes to people that you see in horror movies are very cool, and I probably can't shy away from that, so I'll lean into it, because even though I think it's awesome, someone else might still think, hey, that's messed up. I mentioned Lena Laza earlier playing Still Wakes the Deep, and there's a few times throughout the playthrough where she sees some person mutated in their chair, their entrails gooped across the room, strung up in like weird rainbow pulsing things, and she goes, wow, that's so pretty, look at this is so cool. Meanwhile, the audience in chat is going, wow, that's horrific, let's look away, this is horrible. Do I need to put... Yes, gooped. I don't want to have to put a I don't want to have to put a mature tag onto the stream, so there's only so descriptive I can be about gore and graphic violence. We have to kind of skirt around the issues a little. Gooped. Yes, you run into Cthulhu and he goops you. Okay, so coming back to this horror-wise, or maybe the solution is I don't approach it as horror. Maybe I lean fully into progression fantasy, and the horror is incidental. That would be the other option. If I don't get and can't write horror specifically. Let me try and put a little bit of a synopsis to this. Looking at what we've got so far. So I would write about a singular main character. So our main character gets caught up in some supernatural incident. They manage to make it out really well. They managed to make it out really well and draw the attention of the organization who handled the incident. They offer them a job. That'll be our starting thing. That's pretty standard for progression fantasy. Normally it's some kind of like isekai thing or something like that. You know, they get transported to another world, thrown into danger, and then they make it out through whatever ability they've got. And this kind of in media res intro is a good way to reveal the gimmick. You know, what is it that makes your character overpowered? Because that's just kind of the way it goes in progression fantasy. Not everyone likes it. Some people specifically look for main characters that don't have a cheat ability, and they rise off of their own skill. But if that's what you're going for, then this is still a great way to show it off. You just want to show what makes a character special early on, and you want to highlight what the focus of the growth is going to be, whether it's their skill in using the abilities everyone has better than everyone else does, or if they have some special ability that no one else has. For this particular universe, I'm thinking... Originally, when I started thinking about this, I'd been reading a bunch of Pokemon fanfics, and I was thinking that I would want to do a Pokemon-inspired world, but I don't want to get sued by Nintendo, so how do I make it really different? And I thought, hey, Eldritch Horror. And then I thought about a manga I'd once read, where people could have skills that cost a certain amount of points, and you only had so many points in your soul, so you had to choose what skills to slot in. So I thought an Eldritch Horror world where you collect these entities and you've got 6 kind of slots in your soul for 6 creatures you can bring with you. And then it's Eldritch Horror Pokemon. That was how I initially got to this. So what I'm thinking at this point instead is ditch the Pokemon thing. We can revisit the Pokemon thing maybe, but let's not make it a focus. Instead, everyone has the capacity to use these whatever slots in their soul that you can put Pokemon powers, whatever it ends up being, into. But obviously, being Eldritch, it will most likely drive you mad. So our main character happens to grab one of these during the incident and doesn't go mad, and the organization goes, hey, you want a job because we really need more people who can look into the abyss and not flinch when it looks back. They offer them a job because they have the rare ability to not go immediately mad when exposed to Eldritch entities. What have I written here? Oh, an extra T in there, that was it. Yeah. So that's why the organization wants them, that's how they get into it. The organization is a branch of the government devoted to the containment of supernatural incidents and the protection of the public. I wasn't sure when I was thinking about this what kind of time frame or era I might want to set the whole thing in, because there are advantages to both. Both being the modern day and a more classic fantasy medieval kind of style. I like the modern day one a lot because of the whole three-letter agency bureau aesthetic. Like the SAP Foundation and Control and that kind of stuff really nailed something with that. It's got that kind of weird appeal of being borderline reality. Like it's what makes urban fantasy so good, and it's what makes stuff like the Backrooms so good. But if I go medieval, more classic fantasy, or even full high fantasy other world, I can first of all bring in fantasy races, which is very cool. Secondly, draw on the kind of thing you see in like D&D with the what is it called in D&D? The Far Realms, I think? Far Realms, Outer Realms. Oh, the names are always so similar. But that kind of thing, you know, Illithits, Aboleths, all that good stuff. And it would be just kind of funny to have the very government, like the very three-letter agency style organization, but in the fantasy setting. So still all bureaucratic and stuff like that. You know, not like a cult or a knight order or anything, a full bureaucratic organization that just so happens to answer to the Elven High King instead. On the flip side, It's also very funny to bring the fantasy stuff into the modern setting, so to have our characters running around in weird realms with weird species and all that kind of stuff. There is a reason I love the World and Chronicles of Darkness so much, and why I love Mage the Ascension so much. Both are good. Both are really good. It could even be better if I make our main character not a human in the modern setting. Could really play with that a lot. Puts a whole different perspective as well on the losing who you are, if they're already a little bit weird, and then I can explore in the text what parts of themselves they care about and what things they maybe don't care so much about, and how that relates to how different or similar they are to a human. There's a lot of room for stuff there. All of it very interesting, none of it very scary. None of it very scary. Brings us back to the core issue. Is horror doomed to be nothing more than set dressing in a setting like progression fantasy? Obviously some will instantly disagree because they'll point to some of the horror series that exist and be like, what, but look at this is scary. And I will look at it and go, no, it's not. This is really cool, I love it, but it's not scary. How do I make it more than set dressing? I'm just trying to, I picture the character, I picture what I want them kind of capable of doing. I think something that really draws me into all of this is the way certain things are described. Catalepsis does an absolutely fantastic job of how it handles the metaphors that are used to describe the experience of the Eldritch and Unknowable. Because there are lots of things that the main character goes through and describes going through in pretty good detail, but with the understanding that none of what they're describing is actually what's happening. All of what they're describing is the best metaphors they can come up with to contextualize something impossible. And that I love. That kind of thing I enjoy, and that kind of thing I think I want to try writing. Which is part of the reason why I want to do a horror progression fantasy. So, horror-wise, the unknown and incomprehensible has to feature heavily. Things that can't be described or understood, but you have to try anyway. That, I think, is very good and should feature in this. And on the flip side of that, something I think is underused in general, the horror of understanding perfectly and realizing just how bad it is. I think the idea of like, oh, we don't know what this thing is here for, we don't know what it's doing, it's probably warping all those people into weird caricatures of themselves on complete accident, you know? There's like the movie Annihilation that's really highly praised, where there's no real explanation of whether the entity encountered at the very end is friendly or hostile, if it has any idea of what impact it's having on the world or anything like that, or if it's just interacting as best it can and doesn't realize the harm it's causing. I thought Annihilation was a pretty boring movie with a very unsatisfying ending. Which is great because it's a highly beloved film, so what do we do with that? I think sometimes knowing can be worse. In a horror, you don't want to reveal too much of the monster, you know? You don't want to show the audience the big bad, for the most part, because it's much scarier to imagine something, to fill in the gaps yourself, and maybe even just not fill in the gaps and just leave that empty space to be filled with emotion. But I think since I'm first of all not doing something visual, I'm writing, and since I'm doing something where the character is going to be fairly strong and present more of a direct physical threat, hey, here's exactly what this thing does, and if you let it get you, this will happen to you, could probably be scarier. So the horror of the known, and it's like knowing here we go. Knowing what it is and what it does nothing to prevent those things or to help you stop it. Kind of, I guess, the fear of helplessness and weakness. I put an extra space in there. There we go. The fear of helplessness and weakness. That is something I think we can draw on in progression fantasy. Specifically, we can draw on it and turn it into motivation, because a big part of the story is supposed to be the character growing beyond their own strength. So what is their reason for that? A lot of stories, the reason is just the character likes it. They they get transported to an alternate world that has magic or a lit RPG system or something like that, and they go, hey, this is awesome, I want to get as strong as possible because it's just fun. And those are really some of my favourite characters in that kind of setting, and we might put one in here as a side character. But for our main character, I'm thinking we have them be very realistic and down to earth, very scared but not paralyzed by their fear. So as a result, they put all the effort into growing stronger and facing all of these threats. So we'll play a lot on the fear of helplessness and weakness and then of overcoming it, and the fear of the unknown turning into the fear of the known as they grow strong enough to understand the things that they're up against. So I think that's a decent starting point. We've definitely got kind of a basis of how do you bring progression fantasy and horror together. I want to think a little bit more about the other ones. So isolation, as it relates specifically to progression fantasy, I don't think there's any intrinsic link or difference here, really. I should maybe quickly open up a page here and go types of horror. Slasher, monster, gothic, supernatural, psychological, Lovecraftian. Lots of stuff. Some of these are not categories. These are... That's just Alien the movie. That's not a type of horror. Wikipedia, erotic horror. No, that's not what we're writing. Psychological, gothic horror, westerns, kaiju horror. Let's put kaiju here. Becoming the monster. What else? Technology taking over. Pretty interesting. Dark fantasy, horror, drama. Religious horror, body horror. Fear of harm slash body horror. Put that in there. What else? Cozy horror? That's a thing, really? Cozy horror is a genre of speculative fiction that is intended to disturb frighteners. No, that's just a horror definition. The cozy horror redirects to horror fiction, and there's nothing on the horror fiction page about cozy. Wikipedia, how could you taunt me like this with such a fascinating idea and then steal it away from me? This is the true horror, getting baited by Wikipedia. What else? Oh, detective fiction, yeah. Space horror. I mean, a lot of these aren't really types of fear you put into horror, are they? They're just kind of things you can tangentially do that are related to horror. What else is there? Very specific categories like creepy doll, home invasion, water-based predators. Yeah, these are horror tropes. Things in horror like Ouija boards, stuff like that. Camping is very often a setting for horror. Zombie horror. Zombie horror is kind of its whole own category, isn't it? Yeah, none of this is really quite the thing I'm looking for, where it's like, you know, thriller, slasher, body horror. These are actual types of horror, I feel like. So in relation to the progression fantasy stuff, to come back to this, body horror in progression fantasy, I don't think there's any intrinsic link, but I also think that there isn't any clash, so to speak. It's just a matter of how do you put it into the writing. Because you have to balance time spent on horror descriptions with time spent on our description. And each one detracts from the other to a certain extent, you know? Too much horror takes away from the power and excitement of the main character. Too much power takes away from the fear factor. And in some ways this is me kind of limiting myself in terms of how creative I'm willing to get with it. Because if you just played it fully straight and wrote horror first with the progression elements of the main character getting stronger, it would probably work quite well, prose-wise. But because of kind of my own strong image of progression fantasy and the type of progression fantasy I've read, I want a more progression fantasy traditional protagonist who's going to be not very down most of the time, who's going to focus on their strength and growth and stuff like that, and not on how terrible the situation is. And in that regard, I think the RimWorld influence comes in pretty strongly, because the RimWorld can be a very silly game, and if you watch the recent playthroughs of the channel that I watched, it's Mr. Samuel Streamer on YouTube. They do get very silly, you know. There's horror stuff happening there, but the episodes are very much comedy. He's an extremely funny YouTuber. So yeah, if I draw on that kind of influence, is there any inspiration to be found there? When I think about that and I'm imagining the characters in there and the things they go through, and it's kind of just played off. The horror almost comes more from the audience perspective. The characters are just going through their lives, doing their best. They don't know that they're in a horror series, but the audience goes, hey, what just happened to you was absolutely messed up. And the fact that you're just walking away from it and not dwelling on it, like the way you're choosing to cope, is messed up in its own way. Maybe that's something else to consider. Horror can be kind of personal. A lot of the best and most highly regarded horror movies are kind of psychological horror, and even the ones that are more action, like Alien, are really heavily carried by their characters. People care a lot about the people in a horror movie and what happens to them and how they react to things. So I might want to think about a cast of characters as well, and what the team's gonna look like, and then see what counts as horror for each of them. So we'll have a main character, and for the story structure, they get brought into this organization, they can do the fancy thing with not going mad, and then get stuck into some department. So how do I want to structure this? I could have them just be a pair. If I want to go for a kind of mystery detective style story, which is definitely one option, then the rookie and the more experienced one definitely works. A kind of crime scene investigation style thing where they have a whole team, you want to go for more characters. You know, Control is a video game, so it has the main character that you play, obviously, and then there's like 4 or 5 really important side characters, plus a few lesser ones scattered around. The SCP Foundation doesn't have a main character because it's a collection of articles. Catalepsis has a main character, and then how big is the support? Well, we have a perspective character, but she's not the only main character. They're all kind of very important. You know, she's the main character, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish consistent supporting cast, and then a whole bunch more that are reoccurring. I don't know that I want to write something quite that big, but I'm liking the sound of a kind of team that gets deployed to deal with certain issues. So paranormal investigation team with our main character, with the team leader, the technical person, maybe 2 technical people. So one of them is the lab technician, the other one is the field technician, and then we need like 2 or 3 people who are the muscle. You know, they go out and get things done, save people from the anomalies, shoot whatever can be shot, that kind of thing. So Agent 1, Agent 2. That gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. It's already quite a lot. Let me just take a sip. Okay. The team leader, in a position of responsibility, play on the fear of helplessness. Why can't I not spell helplessness? Helplessness. As they are responsible for everyone else. So we can focus in on that kind of horror with them specifically. Helplessness, isolation, that's really good for a team leader kind of position. I'm thinking of, what's his name? Aaron Hotchner, I think? From Criminal Minds. Really good show, really good character. His kind of personality. Maybe a little friendlier, but we don't need to worry about personality so much right now. But in terms of their position in the team, and what we can likely imply about them as a person due to that, the fear of letting down the others, of getting their team killed, and of being isolated or letting them be isolated, is definitely something we can lean into with them. The lab tech, field tech, agent 1, agent 2. I feel like isolation is maybe something that we can play into with all of these actually, people getting cut off. In fact, maybe this is where we find the actual overlap. This is where we find the point where the two really mesh together. It's not at all unusual in a progression fantasy novel, especially for lit RPG, to have the main character be a bit of a loner. They go off and hunt monsters and level up on their own really consistently. So if we make working together and being in a team really important in this story, we could make isolation a kind of core theme of the horror here. Isolation as a core theme. The characters often end up alone, and that's when the worst things happen to them. They are forced to face and overcome them alone, or fail to. Isolation as the core theme. I think that's good. I think that might actually be a basis to build upon. If I look back at our inspiration sub here, and also as you mentioned in chat earlier, Subnautica. Isolation Subnautica, you're stranded there alone anyway, so that's kind of a default thing. Catalepsis, isolation plays a big part in that story. I don't want to give any spoilers, but yeah, a lot of the worst things for our main character happen because she's alone at certain parts. I really strongly recommend reading Catalepsis, great story. Rimworld Anomaly, it's a colony sim video game. You, the player, have perfect vision, but of course the pawns can only move so fast, they can only be in one place at a time, usually. So isolation horror there, yeah, I think it fits. Rimworld Anomaly in particular, with some of the anomalies like the darkness that pops up. There's definitely themes of isolation in there. Control, I've not actually played myself. I've watched a kind of deep dive by YouTuber BrickyOrchid8 that was really good. But there's themes of isolation in there. I think the main character is looking for her brother, I think it was. And she's got this entity in her head. There's a lot of in there about, you know, her being trapped in the bureau alone, having to get through things alone. There's a few other characters who end up alone when they don't want to be. SCP Foundation. The articles are just way too widespread to really make any coherent judgment on that. But strongly SCP Foundation inspired, the backroom. All about isolation, about getting lost in that liminal space and being cut off. So yeah, we can make that the core theme of the whole thing, isolation. And then with that, as a lens to observe things through, what types of isolation can we have? Physical isolation. For the team leader. They're a very active person, they get involved directly, or... Oh no, you know what? Physical isolation for one of the agents, because like being in the field is their whole thing. Communication isolation for the team leader. They get cut off or lose contact and have to make decisions without the information they want. And without knowing the state of the team and what impact their decisions will have. That will be kind of psychological horror in a lot of ways, where we play really heavily on the mental weight and consequences and the torment of them having to try and keep everyone alive and needing to prioritize who they can reach, who they can save, what they can do, that kind of thing. Excuse me, hiccups. We take another sip. Yeah, so that's for them. For our main character, I mean, an easy one to go for would be social isolation, since they get the fancy powers and stuff like that, and get changed by them. There's a certain distance between them and the others. There are things they can comprehend and experience that the others can't. I guess in terms of a progression fantasy and them being very, very strong, there are certain tasks / locations that only the MC is capable of handling. In the end, they have to face the greatest challenges alone. And that actually is a theme that shows up in Catalepsis as well. I haven't actually read past the part where that's kind of being dealt with, so I don't know how it concludes in Catalepsis, but it's definitely a theme there. Lab technician and field technician. It would be super easy to have a lab tech also be cut off, because they're the one who stays at home while the rest of the team is out. But I think it would be too easy to the point where it would be almost lazy. It wouldn't be as interesting. What else can we do with them? How do you isolate someone that's already isolated, you know? How do you put someone alone that's already alone? Yeah, we can cut off the communication, but if a team's busy, they're probably not phoning back home anyway. To a certain extent it might not matter, because the main character will be the point of view character, so if they're out handling whatever the threat is, then the lab technician is not even going to be seen. Not unless we choose to contact them. Unless I do a point of view switch, which are always a bit risky. Those are hard to implement. You really want to have multiple POVs established from the get-go in a story, or set aside in certain interval chapters and stuff like that. The author Wildbow is really good at that. At the end of each arc in all of his series, he has a little point of view chapter from sometimes one of the enemies, sometimes a different faction involved, stuff like that. And they're always very informative. I might copy some of that kind of idea, but if I don't, how do I isolate the lab tech? And how do I show them being isolated? What sorts of isolation are there really? Right, like the communication, information, social isolation, physical isolation as in being alone, emotionally isolated, which I guess just falls under social isolation. Let's turn to Google and see if we can get some ideas in here. Isolation in horror. Isolation in horror. What do we have here? Do like a good Reddit thread, you always get some very useful information from people that are sharing just because they're eager to share. Now this is mostly recommendations, unfortunately. Here we go, a thread. Concepts in horror. Isolation was with regards to physical location, but also in societal sense. So the Thing and Alien take place in very isolated places. Okay, that's something we can draw on. So isolated location, secure location, in theory, where you can get trapped with the monster. There we go. What's the worst thing you can do to someone who's in a secure location? Make that location unsecure. Turn it into an active danger. You are no longer locked in your safety box, you are trapped with the monster. What else do we have? Nightmare on Elm Street, where they're in a very regular location in the waking world, but isolated in the dreams. Yeah, that's interesting. The Ring is another good example of societal isolation. I don't know anything about The Ring, so I can't really weigh in on that. What else do we have? Isolation in plain sight, as in a person is in trouble but nobody's able to help them no matter what the person does. I should try not to get too hung up on the specific word isolation and let it kind of narrow down my focus a bit too much. I don't need to be able to describe whatever happens to these people as isolation, as long as it gets the feeling across. Let's leave that for a moment and take a step back to review the entire thing we've got so far. So, I get it all on one screen, yeah. Okay, so we have a horror setting inspired by a variety of works with a kind of unifying theme that there is a group or organization who are trying to survive and handle the horrors and potentially protect other innocent people from them. With the exception of RimWorld, the supernatural is kept secret and hidden from the regular world. We want this to be a progression fantasy, so the supernatural can't be 100% Eldritch. It has to be comprehensible enough that our main character can interact with it and use it as a power. They have to be able to grow stronger, which means they either need to understand the thing that they're using, at least enough to use it, or they need to understand it enough that they can develop technology that counteracts it. I'm also just looking to the side and seeing that my model is jittering and lagging like you wouldn't believe. Hey, tracking. Can we reset that real quick? Can we get that smooth again, please? Maybe? Ooh. Oh no, it's not doing it. I've had this problem in the past and I don't know what causes it or how to resolve it. I think it's an issue with the internet. If the connection struggles, then the model starts to get jittery. Okay, well I can't exactly go restart the router while I'm actively on a live stream, unfortunately. So let me see if I can very quickly get this sorted out. Do that. Okay. Here is a boogie stand-in for my model. Looks good. Okay, quick bit of tech troubleshooting. Where was I? So, yeah, based around this kind of aesthetic / theming, progression fantasy, which means there are limits to how eldritch the horror can be. It has to be a minimum amount of comprehensible. We want to use isolation as a core theme, which is good for setting up very specific scenes with various characters. But now that I'm zooming out and looking at the whole thing and thinking about how would I write this as a long-term story, isolation as a theme in a movie, for example, can work pretty well because you can use your couple of hours to really lean into it, and then you're done and you move on. Progression fantasy has a habit of running into very, very, very long stories. So how do we consistently come back to the theme of isolation in a long-running story where I ideally want to have a whole team, without making the team horrible people who constantly leave our main character out in the cold? That's difficult. So maybe not isolation. Maybe isolation is a recurring theme that I draw, or maybe I need to reframe how I'm thinking about isolation. Because I say the word isolation and I picture loneliness, I suppose. Yeah, loneliness is really the good description. But maybe that's not what I should be focused in on. Do I focus in on more the physical part of isolation? Right, like as I wrote here, the characters often end up alone, and that's when the worst things happen to them. They are forced to face and overcome them alone, or so let's remove the word isolation. Being alone as a core theme means the same thing, but wording is important. Wording is very important for what kind of vibe you put forward and how you think about and interpret certain things. Maybe one of my favorite things in writing, especially when I'm doing my scripts for YouTube, is to look at a thing and figure out how I want to phrase it, and then come back later and realize that I can rephrase it differently in the edit to get a much closer presentation to what I was originally going for. I think that really contributes a lot to quality of writing. So, being alone as a core theme. Let's remove isolation down here as well from where I've written it. Therefore, the leader, communication isolation, cut off from communication. There we go. Put that in there instead. Isolated location. We'll keep isolated location for the lab tech because that actually does evoke exactly the kind of thought and image that I was picturing when talking about the lab tech. So let's try and think about what kind of story arc I could put these people in. So obviously the beginning that I've already mentioned, where they end up in a situation and then somehow manage to survive and get picked up by this organization. Not much being alone in there. In fact, that's kind of a finding people, which is fine. So start off the story finding people as setup. Being separated and alone later hurts that much more when you have a chance to get close and comfortable early on. There we go. How can you inflict maximum trauma on your characters? Have them be happy first. The higher they are, the further they can fall. Yeah, so start off the story with that kind of opposite of the theme. Then the first mission. Or would I get sent on? That's pretty easy. Or maybe not that easy. First mission, the ease gets overestimated. The ease gets overestimated, the team ends up split up. This gives an opportunity to reveal each of their individual weaknesses and how they struggle when alone. There we go, we're starting to get a plot together here. Yeah, start of a story, finding people as set up, being separated, then later has that much more, first version they get split up, bringing in the progression fantasy. Character needs to grow in power, emotionally too because that's what I want, but in power because that's the genre that we're writing. So after they get split up, it gets resolved. Being split up gets resolved by the MC getting stronger. In the process, the MC gets more isolated as they are put on a pedestal and expected to be able to handle things. One of the other team members gets more isolated for the opposite reasons as they become somewhat redundant in the face of the MC's power and don't feel useful anymore. Alright. That's a pretty good setup of a kind of beginning section of a story. We've now got basically the seeds sown for lots and lots of conflict and a kind of method to mesh our two themes together. The main character can continue to grow and get stronger without impacting the theme of isolation, because as they grow and get stronger, they become more isolated, and so does everyone around them as the kind of team dynamics shift. With them being left alone because everyone expects them to be able to cope with whatever it is, and others being left alone because with everyone focused on the main character, they get kind of left behind and forgotten. That feels like a solid basis, I think. So where to take that next? Not every scene, every mission, every incident has to be fully focused on all parts of a story, all themes and ideas of a story. So there doesn't have to be growth every single time anything happens, and there doesn't have to be people getting lonely every single time something happens. But regularly, we want it to be a running theme. So after that, what else do we do? The next mission is run properly, but with a different team dynamic than before. This mission run probably though with a different team dynamic than before. Different people are taking the lead or taking the spotlight. The team leader puts in effort to keep everyone together and has success in getting them closer to each other. This is set up for later, where their closer bonds will be used to hurt them more, and the team leader's success will drag him down when he is forced to make hard choices about his team. Everything that happens, everything good, we can use and rework and twist into consequences, into downsides, into negatives. There's always a way to turn every happy point into another twist of pain for the characters, and a way to turn every bit of pain into another opportunity for growth. I think what we've got established here is a pretty good formula for how I could write a story like this to a certain extent. I don't think this formula is viable for long-term progression fantasy storytelling. You couldn't write, you know, a 12-book series out of this, because at some point or another it's going to become repetitive, that the characters are constantly being brought closer together and then suffering for it, and closer together and suffering for it, or that they succeed emotionally in one aspect only to then fail in another aspect as a result of those emotions. This is a setup for a single book story, very much so, not a long-term story. It's also, I think, not necessarily a setup for a story that I would write. I think I really like this, and I think if it existed, I might want to read it, but I don't think this is the kind of story that I would write myself. I like my stories a little more lighthearted, I think, and I like my progression fantasy leaning more into the power fantasy than gritty realism. What would this actually be like? I know deconstructions of the genre are super popular and have been for the last few years, just in any genre really, and while I think a lot of good has come out of it, it's not usually my cup of tea. So with all that said, let's rename this page the Exploration of Horror versus Power. So in the initial goal that was set, we have succeeded. We have figured out how we can do a little more traditional horror with a psychological focus and combine it together with the progression fantasy formula. I do, however, have a bit of a genuine interest in writing something with a horror background / theming in a progression fantasy kind of setting. So let's move on to writing. Let's switch these around if we can. There we go. Yeah, let's switch these around, and let's, on this side, open a new. There we go. My progression fantasy story. Or let's call it lighter progression fantasy horror story. There we go. Need to take a drink again. So my usual approach when both story writing and world building is that I will build like 4 or 5 different things, each of which explores aspects of something that I like, that I try to then flesh out, and eventually when I run into certain walls with those aspects, I will rip out the parts that I like from all my ongoing projects and recombine them into a new project that incorporates all those aspects and works much better than any of them could have on their own. So what we're going to do here is take the bases I've made with this pseudo setting over here and see what we can transport over to the main one and what parts we decide to keep. So from what I was mentioning earlier, I do think we want to be set in the present day. This will be urban fantasy. Urban fantasy with fantasy races. With fantasy races? I'm feeling it very strongly, but do I actually want to? Because this is the one place where I seriously suffer from world builder's disease. I love detailing out all the different races that live in my fantasy worlds and where they live and how they separate and intermingle and why they're there and all that kind of stuff. But it often doesn't actually lead anywhere or contribute anything to the world or the story. So I have to, whenever I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, let's absolutely throw some elves in there, we need more elves everywhere, take a moment, take a step back. Should there actually be elves in here? I'm picturing the main cast. Just vague outlines. I'm picturing these people with our main character. Is anything added by them not being human? I would be opening up what I said earlier, the space of discussing what things are horror from what different species perspective and what changes each of them undergoes that would discuss one and not the other. But I would also be filling up and taking up world building time, world building bandwidth with detailing lore and background for how these races live together and interact. A lot of that can be swept past. Something that lots of people who love world building and also want to tell a story in their world seriously struggle with is that they feel the need to detail absolutely everything about their worlds, to go into complete depth on how everything works, and everything has to be explained and justified and whatever else. And really, the vast majority of things don't have to whatsoever. In fact, the more you explain things, the more you force yourself into a corner where you have to explain things. If you leave things vague purposefully in a lot of places, it doesn't then feel weird when something else is vague. So for example, in a sci-fi, it's very common to hand wave faster than light travel, you know? Like, okay, so we've got humanity, they've made it off the Earth, it's in the future, we've invented artificial gravity, we've invented faster than light travel, and besides that, things are pretty much mostly the same. Maybe there's a laser gun thrown in for good measure, and people are perfectly willing to just buy that. If you then start going, oh, and our faster than light travel works through this misapplied real-life scientific principle, and our artificial gravity is actually spin gravity generated through this, and our ships are designed to be to take momentum into account, well, congratulations, you now need to explain how to make a functioning laser gun, which you can't, because you've made everything else hard science. So now the audience is going, oh, this is a hard sci-fi, you've got reasons and explanations. Where are they for everything else? You've got alien species, they better not look like humans, and if they do, they better have been life-seeded by a progenitor species long ago. You better explain everything. Yeah, not even a wizard did it, just don't say anything. This is how the world works, full stop. In a high fantasy world with humans, elves, dwarves, etc., because there used to be other human-like as species descended from common ancestors with humans, like Neanderthals and stuff like that, and they no longer exist, everyone assumes that if there is a planet with multiple thinking, sapient, human-level intelligent species, early on in their evolution, as soon as they start getting smart, one will wipe out all of the others. So a fantasy race with elves, a fantasy world with elves, dwarves, etc. is considered unrealistic. If you start putting in evolutionary theory and explanations, people are going to pick at it and people are going to insist that these races shouldn't all coexist, that it's unrealistic. If you just don't address it and you just go, here are my fantasy races, no one is going to raise a fuss. There will be some hardcore world-building fans online who talk about how it doesn't actually make sense and stuff like that, but they will be in a minority and they won't actually care that much. You can just, and often should, not explain things. If they're not directly relevant to your story, or it's not an aspect of the world building that you really, really enjoy and you want to talk about, then don't include it, you know? If it's absolutely your deal and you love evolutionary theory, then go for it. Really double down on the details because you've got the knowledge to make it actually functional. But if you don't feel obligated to. Excuse me for just a moment, I've got to blow my nose. Alright, much better. I've got this weird pseudo-cold where I'm not actually even slightly ill, I'm perfectly fine, but for some reason I'm still ending up with a blocked nose. So to bring that entire long tangent about hard and soft world building and justifications back to this, do I want fantasy species in here? And I think the reason I'm feeling yes so hard is because I absolutely love Monster Girls, and I want an excuse to put all manner of weird and funky creatures into my world building. And a horror setting is a great place to put some of the stranger and more unusual ones in. Is that a good reason to actually do it world building wise? No, probably not. So urban fantasy, humans only. We can self-indulge later, but not right here. There will be a... And what do I call the organization? The Bureau? Do we go really classic on that? The something 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 foundation. There will be a 3-letter... Is 3-letter agency... I do want to make sure I'm using this word correctly, because I actually think it might refer to something specifically American and not just to an acronym agency. Alphabet agencies in the sense of a term may also be called 3-letter agencies because they often use 3-letter. 3-letter acronym. The Alphabet agencies are New Deal agencies of the US federal government agencies created as part of the New Deal by President Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. It is a specifically American thing. But we are drawing on very heavily American influences when writing something like this with the SCP Foundation or Control. Like that is based on like the FBI, the spooks, that kind of stuff. So there will be a 3-letter agency responsible for dealing with the supernatural. The supernatural... the supernatural world will be a hidden world. I like urban fantasy where it's all like goblins are working at Starbucks, but I also do very much enjoy the it's all secret hush hush kind of hidden world, and I think that that's more suitable for the horror aspect. Just a lot more suitable. The whole, you know, unknown thing, kind of stuff like that. So the supernatural world will be a hidden world. I had a thought just now and it's escaped me. Can I find it again? No, it's gone. So yeah, urban fantasy, theatre agency, supernatural hidden world. It will be super super science, psionics, eldritch / alien entities, and not magic. Functionally, in a lot of ways, these are the same thing. There's not a real difference between a psionic caster and a spell slot caster. You know, it's a recurring issue in like D&D and stuff like that, where they try to make psionics and stuff like that and differentiate it from regular casters, but there's no real difference besides the theming. Same thing as like the difference between a druid and a wizard. It's about the aesthetic, not about how they do magic. You know, the end result is still supernatural thing happens, but aesthetic wise, for this kind of horror world, we're going to go with nonsense science and psionics and eldritch alien entities, not magic. I think that will suit it better. The tone. I'm probably going to go for kind of comedy horror. I just like it more. Stuff like Cabin in the Woods and various vampire movies, names of which escape me, various cartoons, you know, the Hazbin Hotel. Hazbin Hotel is not a horror in any way, shape or form, but there is gore and stuff like that in it, and it's very comedy. I think horror comedy suits me better, but not that comedy. More like light-hearted horror, not laugh out loud horror. Yeah. Like basically the thing I was describing early on when talking about other progression fantasy, where it's like, this is not a story built first and foremost to be scary to the audience. This is a story built first and foremost to be cool and interesting, and horror just kind of happens to be an aspect of the story. You know, this is horror for people who don't get scared very much. So with that kind of thing in mind, do I go through and make another full theming exploration kind of page, or do I start, you know, putting notes together and making world building notes? I'm probably going to do the world building for this off stream, because I do think that is a series that I might genuinely try writing at some point, but I don't want to spoil too much of it on here. But we can do a little bit of the thought processes behind it. I still think having multiple characters is cool, and I still think that these ideas of the unknown becoming known and still being horrible are very cool. Maybe that's what I should write down here. What kind of thing do I want the story to have in it to actually be interesting? And I want the MC to get powers that are not so much hard to understand. I want the audience to know exactly, like, hey, if they do this, here's the output, but more like hard to understand in the sense that, like, we don't fully understand the process of what's going on. Powers that are esoteric. Yeah, let me rephrase how I've written this. The MC will get powers that are esoteric in nature and can be described in great and beautiful detail. Because I love that kind of stuff. I love seeing it, and I am looking forward to writing it. So yeah, the main character's powers will be very funky, very unusual. They'll do weird things, or they will work in weird ways that give me lots of opportunity to describe how they look, feel like, what strange effects they have. Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm here for. The horror aspects will focus on body horror, fear of, how do I describe this? We'll focus on body horror, fear of being forcefully altered, and the general background horror of violent things happening to people. It's a kind of vibe that you get from, and now I've got really very specific examples, but the kind of vibe you get from like the art of Juniper Actius, the VTuber, some of the horror stuff that she's drawn, or various dark magical girl stories that I've read. Ones you can find on Royal Road, like Lit RPG or Progression Fantasy ones. Maybe Stray Cat Strut by Ravenstagger is a good example. His stories are very light-hearted. Just the way he writes, the kind of jokes he puts in, the tone of it, super light-hearted. But also Stray Cat Strut, its setting, is a full-on cyberpunk dystopia, and like it doesn't hold back on the dystopia part, but it still manages to be really funny and light-hearted in the character interactions and the tone of a world building and the people that we meet in the story. So that's the kind of thing I'm going for here. Yeah, horror aspects focused on this kind of stuff. The story will focus on a monster of the week maybe kind of threat. Monster of the week type of plot, with the characters regularly acquiring how do you spell acquiring? Oh, I missed a C, that's what it was. With the characters regularly acquiring new powers or items from what they defeat. There will be an aspect of not base building because they're part of a bigger organization, but an aspect of base management for the creatures and items they capture that can't be neutralized or destroyed. Some arcs will take place in their facility based on interactions with other members, internal threats, and attempts to get useful information or powers out of captured entities. There we go. Spell entities correctly. Yeah, that's good. I think at this point in my normal creation process, I would now start writing a paragraph or two, decide that there's everything wrong with it, and then go back to rework all of this. And in order to start writing, I would have to come up with a name for the main character, and that is a true time sink. I will easily spend a couple of hours going through Fantasy Name Generator trying to find just the right kind of name for my character. Instead of that, let's try and focus a little bit more in on the world building and the abilities. So what I mentioned earlier about having like slots in your soul to put abilities into, that is a concept I've played with a few different times in a few different sorts of settings, because it's just one I find very interesting for reasons honestly unknown to me. Is this the setting that I want to try and actually bring it to life and actually put the idea into practice? I think probably not. I think it's maybe a little too rigid for something like this. That could of course be exactly what this needs, because it's really easy with this kind of vague magic to be able to establish what it can and can't do. And that's fine, you can do soft magic and not put in clear boundaries, but I'm planning to have a lot of fight scenes. This is progression fantasy, and the progression will be the character's capacity for violence, which means it's extremely important that we know exactly how strong they are and exactly what threats they can and cannot take on. So clear restrictions on the abilities of the characters, definitely an important one in this kind of story. But how clear? The story Tenebrum on Royal Road, really good story about a shadow in a swamp growing to great power and being very evil. We have an understanding of how strong it is at any given time of the story, but we have less clear restrictions on what the exact extent and nature of its powers is. There's never a hard line of like, oh, it can fire an orb of shadow of this strength and this level of creature it won't work against, and this level of creature it will. It's more like it encounters a weird, not to give any spoilers, it encounters another entity in a city, and the entity attempts to trap it in this like infinite space, but the creature can reach out to the darkness, because it is darkness, and get out of the trap. And you couldn't, before that encounter, have predicted precisely what either the shadow or the other entity does, or precisely which one would win and why. There's limits, there's an understanding of certain things are beyond it, but there is not a, hey, this is exactly how strong it is, this is what's actually beyond it and why it's beyond it. We don't get that kind of detail. And I think that's what I want to do here, but it's a pretty narrow tightrope to walk, right? Like there's not an easy method to get that kind of balance right. It's really just you have to think carefully about your choices as you go through. So with that in mind, let's think about some abilities that I do and don't want people to have, and how good I want them to be. I'm going to draw strongly on catalepsis for inspiration here, because it does the description of abilities really, really beautifully. So an easy one to rule out: no time shenanigans. Shenanigans. There we go. I still wrote it wrong. That's one in too many. No time shenanigans. I just don't want to open the door up to that kind of nonsense. It can be very cool, and if you restrict it, you can do it well. Like, for example, that one scene with the Time Eaters in Legion, where he's facing off against them and they keep resetting him back, and the way he overcomes it, again, no spoilers, but the way he overcomes it is really, really cool. But I don't want to mess with time. I just don't. I know that if I leave the door open to myself, I'm going to want to do more with it, and that is very, very dangerous. In fact, let me remove no time shenanigans because it's kind of a given, and instead put in the majority of powers will focus on understandable physical processes and material. For example, manipulating or freezing water, but they will do so in ways where the outcome is not clearly tied to the action. For example, off the top of my head, I think I had a very clear image or something like this earlier. Something water related. For example, using water droplets to distort vision in order to actually distort space and bypass an obstacle. We're going to have lots of characters or entities themed around specific elements or materials or whatever, whose power sets have really nothing to do with their chosen thing. Right, like fire mages who are all about, well, not the things fire is usually about, which is either destruction or healing, something completely unrelated. A fire mage who's all about communication and accessing computers. I don't know, something like that. The entities and objects. Okay, my spelling is getting worse and worse. I gotta focus a little here. The entities and objects they encounter will not follow these same patterns and can function however they want. The story will take place primarily in one city, but with weekend. I just woo frequently on accident. The W is right next to Q. Frequent travel to places outside or adjacent to reality. There's a few in particular that I have in mind, which I think are always very cool. Let me just take a drink. Other realms will include a hidden city, so a kind of, you know, like if you know how to go down the right alleyways at the right time or turn the right corners that don't actually exist and stuff like that, you can reach places in the city that aren't on any map and yet still exist there, or even full on leave the city and end up in a kind of mirror slash alternate city. A world inside reflections, because those are always very cool. A dream realm is also very cool. I want a bunch of these. I want like a dozen different alternate worlds they can go to that are all a little bit weird. A empty world that all desolate, rocky wasteland, and then others can be made up kind of as the story requires them to suit specific types of entity or types of character and all of that. But just you know, as an example of a few of these. Some aspects of this over here are going to make it over into here. Specifically, what was it? Not the horror stuff, because we've changed completely the entire feel and theme of that. But the... where was it? I've already put the horror of unknown stuff in here. Horror comedy, lighthearted, yada yada. Partial focus on body horror, being falsely altered, and the general background horror. I need to add that onto here. The horror of the known. There we go. Alright, the power growth. That's what I wanted. Power growth will mostly be growth in... there we are. Growth in skill and the ability to use their power in new and inventive ways. There will be very occasional growth in the raw strength of their powers, and even more rare, addition of new powers. Now, powers that grow their strength, new ones, is a bit of a tricky subject because there's really no way of doing it right or wrong. It's just a question of figuring out how and what suits your story and what you want to go for. Every path you take in this regard will have consequences, and all of them will have trade-offs. So, for example, if I want to take a story and give new powers very rapidly, that's fine and can be quite interesting. It can be exciting to be handed new skills all the time and to see the character trying out the new things and being kind of extremely versatile through the sheer volume of nonsense that they can throw at someone. This kind of jack of all trades, Batman, here is my tool for this situation kind of character. But it will cheapen the kind of excitement of each individual power. You have to be very careful when and how you give them out. And you do kind of by necessity need to limit quite how strong each power you give out is and how much impact it has on the story. Because you can't be every couple pages going, and here's another thing that completely alters how this person fights fundamentally, right? Like that, you run into issues with that. For the path that I've chosen here, power growth being mostly in skill and the ability to use what they've already got, that gives me quite a bit of control, I would say, because I can decide very, very easily, very naturally for myself when I feel like a character has mastered something or understood something enough. It also opens up the opportunity for me to have them make realizations at any time, including specifically when the plot requires it. But that's a double-edged sword because you can't be too obvious with that. You can't be handing out mid-fight power-ups like candy, or the audience is going to start to go, this is just plot armor. They always pull out the solution to exactly what they need in the middle of a fight. You have to be careful of that. It's one where if you do it wrong, the danger to the trade-off can far outweigh the benefits. You know, if you do too many powers, then it's just kind of annoying and each individual power is cheap. But the reader will stop paying as much attention to them. They'll focus more on other aspects. If those other aspects are still good, then they'll overlook the deluge of powers and just move on with their day. If you're doing very few powers, and each one matters a lot, and you're doing it as I'm doing with you can just figure out how to be better with your power, and you do it wrong, the readers are going to be very upset. They're going to be upset about characters having plot armor, or they're going to be upset about characters holding the idiot ball, because if your character can get stronger by just thinking hard and being better with their ability, then it's like, well, why didn't they figure this out earlier? How did they miss this obvious interaction, right? You have to do a lot of work in terms of setup and payoff to make each reveal feel earned and to justify why it didn't happen earlier. I think it's worth it. I think it's one of the better ways and it makes for stronger stories. But it is dangerous, and there will always be people who disagree with how you chose to do it. Then the next part here, there will be very occasional growth in the raw strength of their powers. I think that's always nice to have. I am a fan of progression fantasy, so I get the appeal of a power fantasy quite well, and every now and then it's just nice to just be able to hit things harder. You know, if you've got a character who's been throwing around little firebolts, and now they can throw a full fire ball, that's just cool. And by making it occasional, like the kind of cultivation novel style, you've moved into the next realm kind of thing, it gives you very easy ways to clearly mark where the higher threats should come in. You know, when do you start throwing bigger monsters at your characters, or when are your characters ready to go back and face this thing that they previously had to run away from? Well, it's after the raw power-up. It's when they're just flat out stronger than before. And then finally, the addition of new powers. I mentioned before, at the start of this, that the growth in skill by just tossing new things on all the time is one option. To make the other option, the addition of powers, be really, really rare, again, a balancing act. You get the benefits that when it happens, it just feels that much cooler. These are extremely limited, they don't come around often, but when a character suddenly is able to do just an entirely new thing, it's exciting for the reader. In this framework that I'm using here, where they could grow in skill instead of growing in raw strength, having an entire new power to work with means that they can suddenly, from the ground up, start coming up with new ways to use this new power, and having the experience of already going through that once, they can go through it much quicker the second time. It lets you basically have the best of both worlds. You can throw in that, hey, you've suddenly got a dozen new abilities in quick succession, but have it feel earned because it's a whole new power set that they're just exploring the basics of. So it makes sense that they discover a whole bunch of new things very, very early on. In terms of how it can go wrong, it's one of the more safe ones, really. It can go wrong in the sense that you can be too stingy with it, and the readers might start to get bored if you're not able to provide sufficiently interesting new power-ups through the skill growth avenue. And of course you have to time it properly. If it's such a monumental change that they get a new power, then it can't. This is one that I think almost can't be a middle of a battle edition, because in the context of being powers that you have to learn to use properly, if you suddenly get a whole new set mid-battle, that should almost be a downside more than an upside. You should be distracted by the new senses, skills, abilities, whatever it is you've gotten, instead of being empowered by them. You can do it mid-battle, but it would require tons and tons and tons of setup, I think. But beyond that, new powers rare is fairly safe. That was a long ramble, and I need to take another drink. Now, with the Book of Powers there, since we are doing a horror story, and we're doing a progression fantasy horror story with the characters growing stronger, we want to consider the kind of flip side of the whole thing. How horrifying are our main and point of view characters? Does the horror simply come from the things they encounter, or are they themselves pretty scary? There is a tabletop RPG that I enjoy greatly called Sins. It's a post-apocalyptic RPG where the world has been overrun by a sort of zombie virus. It's a fancy zombie virus that kind of mutates certain people it infects and operates on a hive mind. I'm not a huge fan of zombies, but they did a pretty good job in Sins. And your player characters are what are called nemesaries, who are basically people that should have died and become zombies, but instead managed to die and retain their mind, and now have zombie mutant magic powers without being part of a hive mind. And a lot of them are pretty scary. I mean, there's some of the abilities you can take in that book to turn people inside out and make bones sprout out of places and bite someone and put parasite eggs in them. A lot of stuff in there is quite horrible. And that would be, I think, one of the places where a progression fantasy story could really lean into the horror stuff, in having it be the main character that is a source of fear for everyone that they meet. And I think that could be pretty cool. It would alter the perspective of the characters quite substantially, because I think there's two routes I can go down with this, both of which I've actually explored in the past in other world building I've done off stream. So there's the kind of law and order route you can go down. So our main characters are very caring of regular people. They're doing this because it's the right thing to do, and we run the whole story as a almost crime procedural where they're trying to go in, figure out what happened, sort the situation. And that's a bit more SCP Foundation, with, you know, the mobile task forces going in and securing something. On the other hand, the characters have a horror perspective. I've done some world building in the past for a magical girl setting, where the idea was basically there are a bunch of SCP-style anomalies, and the contract creatures, evil ones, a la, what's the damn show called? Magical Girl, Magica Magica, have decided, hey, you know what, humans are neat and all, but actually these eldritch beings from beyond would also make super awesome magical girls. And so we get a bunch of magical girls running around that, like, eat people's souls, and people go insane when they look at them, which is hardly an original idea. I've seen that premise in a bunch of different places, but it is a very good one, and I did think I had some interesting spins on it. So we could take that kind of premise and bring it into here, and have our characters actively embrace their descent into being horror movie villains instead of horror movie protagonists. Both sides have their merits, both sides provide a pretty interesting story. I think if I wanted to take from both, it would be easier to lean heavily into the characters are the horror side and have elements of the characters are doing crime procedural, then it would be the other way around. Because if the characters are doing... If we're playing the crime procedural stuff straight, and the characters are, you know, hero agents out to stop the supernatural, then it doesn't make too much sense for them to indulge heavily in becoming the supernatural, which means it would have to happen incidentally or a there's no other choice kind of way. It would become a very serious and sad story if I leaned into the this has to happen, we need the power, because at that point it goes back to some of the stuff we looked at earlier, like the fear of losing oneself, or what was in the chat earlier. The message is still here. Fear of yourself changing, like knowing you aren't who you used to be and you don't know who or what you're becoming. That kind of stuff. That becomes almost a necessity at that point. I could play it completely for goofs and have them be just the worst cops ever, which would be funny too, but I think that's something I can do if I lean into their monsters side and then tack on their monsters that work for a government agency. So I think that is the path I'm going to take. The main character and their team lean heavily into becoming eldritch horrors themselves and are not at all serious government agents. And I'm surprised that we've arrived at this as a conclusion, because over the past few days when I've been imagining this setting, when I've been kind of running through some ideas and world building in my head, I felt pretty confident that the conclusion I would arrive at would be a more serious tone. I'd really expected that I would write like very serious, straight-laced spooks, you know? The Bureau agents, the people, you know, the Men in Black kind of thing, but more serious than the Men in Black movies now that I think about it. Maybe that is an inspiration I should add to my list, the Men in Black movies. They're pretty good. And they're very full-on spooks, government agency, take it seriously because we are protecting the world and lives are at risk, but also the movies know how to have some laughs along the way. Could I incorporate something like that into what I'm doing? I guess the question would be, even if they're eldritch monsters and not serious government agents, do they still care? You know? They still take their work seriously and want to protect people. They might falls their superiors a lot of grief with their behavior, but in a serious situation they will follow orders and get the job done. Alright, there we go. I like this. I like this as a framework. I think this is a good kind of starting point. Off stream, I think I am going to take this idea and see if I can write something for it. For the purposes of this stream, I think we're done with this particular thought exercise. I think the conclusion I've ultimately come to as far as progression fantasy and horror in world building is concerned is that it is doable, but not in the classic way that horror is done. And I think part of that might just be the format, because there just aren't short progression fantasy stories, because the entire goal and core of the progression fantasy is the continuous growth. And yeah, characters over the course of a regular book will and can experience growth. Other way around, can and will experience growth, but not in the focus and extent of a progression fantasy story. And I think that they work specifically in the web serial and 10 books released on Kindle Unlimited kind of format. I think that just suits them better. Because these are stories that want to be very long. They want to show you every step of the way as the character gets bit by bit stronger and stronger. Or even if they're getting stronger faster, they want to show it keep going and that power be expressed and explored. And that just requires a longer medium, which web serials and long-running series on Kindle are very well suited to. Whereas a regular book, even a trilogy, maybe not so much. Regular books want a little more of a beginning, middle, end structure and to come to clear conclusions that power fantasies and progression fantasies just aren't suited to. Which means that the horror aspects are bound by the medium as well, and certain things like psychological horror just don't work as well for it. Because a psychological horror really wants to come to a very harsh conclusion, right? It wants to hammer home either the damage that's done to the poor protagonist, or the catharsis of the situation being resolved, or whatever else, whatever route the story takes. It really does want to have either a very big, explosive, or very small, dark, somber kind of conclusion, that kind of thing, which this just isn't suited for. And I think that's a good enough conclusion to come to. Which does leave us only about 2.5 hours into the stream, and I'm pretty sure we could get another hour out of this if I can decide on what else we want to do. We could world build a bit more on something else. There is, of course, if I have a look down here, this one? Yeah. Do you want to switch over Streamlabs? Come on, show me the right window. Where is it? Obsidian.exe, but not this one, the other one. I think I have to close the page for it to find it. It's so much easier when it's a game capture, because I can just use the shortcut key and go and capture window in the foreground. But Obsidian is not a game, so it doesn't register on game capture, and instead I have to use window capture, which does not work as well. Maybe if I change this setting, find window of the same type, find window of the same executable, there we go, that one accepts. Troubleshooting midstream. Yes, we do still have the high fantasy setting that we can explore. Alternatively, I have been wanting to think about some Wild West stuff. I've recently really strongly had the image stuck in my head of a snake girl, a Lamia gunslinger. That's just been plastered in my mind and I can't get rid of the thought. But I realized that I just don't have enough knowledge of Wild West movies. I've seen like maybe 2 or 3 ever. I know the tropes to a certain extent, they're kind of too ubiquitous not to know, but I don't have enough actual material to work with, enough experience in that kind of setting to start world building in one. I wouldn't know what to do with it beyond, you know, Snake Girl has a showdown with someone and shoots them. The end. Story finished. Let me take another sip. Almost out of drink. Okay, so looking back to the previous world building exercise, the classic fantasy story, where were we at? We've got the party, we've got the members of the party. I'm pretty sure I was trying to figure out a 4th member, because 3 is just not quite enough. We have our chosen one, leader of the party, taught by the mentor. What kind of powers did we give them? Right, with a strong affinity to life, your chosen one should be both strong against yet weak to death and undeath. Due to their unique style of their magic, they're able to withstand it. This makes them the only one capable of wielding the Sword of Legend. Right, it's attuned to undeath, which we need to do to beat the evil undead. Okay, I'm starting to remember this. So the chosen one, who's like an apothecary with strong life magic. We have the Flame Knight, the young member from the Order of the Eternal Flame. Yeah, I remember this. And the Gravekeeper, who I've mostly included based on the vibes. Okay, let's see if we can continue this and try to come up with some more party members. I was trying not to stereotype the people into roles based on their powers too much. So for example, the chosen one, despite being the nature aligned one and probably with some healing magic and stuff like that, is not, you know, the party healer. They're the main character, they wield the sword. They're the hero, so to say. The Flame Knight shouldn't be rash and hot-headed. In fact, considering the nature of the order they're a part of, the Order of the Eternal Flame, and how it's a kind of how they've been in this very long, grindy, dragged out war against the undead. They're probably a very grim and dour kind of organization. So what kind of recruits would an organization like this draw in? And I imagine the answer is probably going to be a mix of very bright-eyed and hopeful people who want to genuinely make a difference and do good, and very disillusioned people who are just kind of there because they've got nowhere else to go realistically. So which of those do we want our Flame Knight to be? They are hopeful, disillusioned. Which of the two? The Flame Knight, the young knight in the Order of the Eternal Flame, who joins the party after the Chosen One attempts the trials. So they see this person come in and walk away with the Sword of Legend, and they go, hey, I need to be a part of this. Or does the Order assign them? Did we write that anywhere? They constantly leave the undead. North Castle is their primary defense. The Old Castle, the Temple. Yeah. No, I don't think we wrote anywhere whether they join because they want to, or because they are dispatched. So let's just decide that first. They are sent with the Chosen One, or they choose to go with the Chosen One. I'm going to say I would prefer, because we're leaning into classic fantasy tropes here, I would prefer the whole, like, you know, you have my sword and my bow and my axe kind of thing. The whole fellowship, basically. They choose to go with the Chosen One after being impressed with them. They can be the good supportive friend, right? Like they were disillusioned with the world and joined the Order only for something to do and roof over their head. But they could never quite give up on hope, and seeing someone capable of wielding the sword inspired them greatly. So they chose to take a chance on it. There we go. Okay, so that gives a little bit more background. So we now have the Chosen One, who is going to be someone fairly caring and like community focused, just based on how they were raised by, raised and taught by the mentor and stuff like that, and work as an apothecary. But I'm pretty sure we also put that they love to go traveling, yeah, and see the many sights of the world. Having seen the damage done by attacks from the undead and knowing firsthand the attacks have been getting worse, they accept the quest and set out to save the land. So just genuinely good-hearted person. Then we have a Flame Knight who had been falling into despair, but has their passion reignited by the Chosen One and decides to take a chance on them, maybe being able to save everyone. The Gravekeeper. So we've got our good-hearted hero, we've got their supportive best friend type character. What else do we need for a good party? What roles do we want to fill? What roles are too cliche? I don't want to just shuffle someone off to the side as the big guy and then have them be dumb on top of it. I don't think that's a good trope to use. I don't want to delegate someone as the healer and the caring one either. That's not great. Some stories have a party have the kind of evil one, you know, the rogue, the thief, the not really moral, mostly along for their own interests but still cares about the party kind of character. And I do think that's a decent dynamic. We could include something like that, actually. Do we make that the Gravekeeper? That would be an interesting juxtaposition if they're very solemn and proper about their duty as a Gravekeeper. Very solemn, serious, and devout about their duties to the dead. However, they are also otherwise a bit of a scoundrel. When their order looks for volunteers to join the hero's party. They decide to go along entirely for the fame. They look at the strength of the hero and the flame knight and decide that they can probably get the job done, so there's no danger in tagging along. Of course, they'll be proven wrong along the way and then have to step forward and put a proper effort in, and there'll be character development and growth and all that good stuff. But that gives us a basis for their personality. So we've got one kind of snarky nuisance, one kind-hearted leader, one devout best friend slash follower. What other fun interaction can we throw in there personality-wise? Because that is, of course, the difficulty with the kind of tropey approach to choosing the personalities of the main party, of the main heroes in the party. While they are tropey, and while they do reduce the characters to almost caricatures to a certain extent, it also works really, really well for storytelling, because you get such strong, distinct personalities, even if they are one note, that interact and clash with each other in a lot of really interesting ways. So using the tropes is actually quite useful in terms of telling a story if you don't want to go too deeply into character interactions, into what these people are actually like as people. If you only observe them in the context of how they are as the hero's party and how they interact with each other, then within the space of one novel or with one trilogy, where you're constantly busy with the plot, the prophecies, the enemies that are coming along, the life and death situations, there's not a whole lot of room to actually explore every single person's entire personality, what they think, how they act, what they believe in. So it doesn't really matter if they're all that one note. You can just really double down on the parts of their personality that clash or mesh really well with the rest of the party and ignore anything deeper. So with all of that in mind, where we've got two very good people, one less good but still nice person, I guess we kind of need someone for the others to ribble a little. We need someone who's meek and naive. So how do we put that into this kind of setup? Who can we have that's meek and naive, but still provides something valuable to the party, and is not a healer, because I don't like that trope. I just don't like it. What else can someone contribute to this entire setup? Hard to say, really. I mean, picture them getting into the kind of troubles they might be getting in. We need to deal with undead, which all three of the existing ones are suited to. We gotta be good in a fight, which we've pretty much got covered. Do we need magic? We kind of have magic covered. Everyone's a bit magical. Magic specialist? A navigator? We need someone who knows all about the ancient ruins and paths and all that nonsense. The Flame Knight will know some of it, especially since the evil undead has taken up a residence in the old castle, right? This one over here. Yeah, former headquarters of the Order of the Eternal Flame, destroyed almost a century ago, now houses one of the underlings of the evil undead. So where's the evil undead headquartered? I haven't decided yet. That's not written yet. North Castle, Temple, Old Castle, belonging to the Order previously, right. The Evil Castle. The Undead's lair is thought to be at the center of its domain in the Evil Castle. Okay, so the Old Castle Right, that's even better then. So the old castle is along the way and one of the underlings is in there. But then after that they need to figure out where in the middle of the evil undead's territory is its lair and how do they get there. So they need a navigator style character, and that's what this fourth party member can be. Some kind of archaeologist, historian, something like that. What could we have them be? An Indiana Jones style character? Someone very adventurous, like the Lorehold school from Magic the Gathering, something like that. That's an opportunity. But I did say I want him to be the more meek person in the group. How do I fit that together? Or do I discard that idea entirely? We could instead have them be the kind of thoughtless one, not maybe naive, but almost airheaded one, the one who's over eager about their subject. So they will go run off and get all excited about something without thinking through the consequences. So the eager... What title do we give them? Just Explorer? The eager explorer. They'd have something in common with the chosen one, while still being different enough in their fields of expertise to not overlap with each other. Put that in characters. There we go. The eager explorer. An expert in ancient ruins and the expert in ancient ruins and the history of the land. They are sought out by the party to help them navigate in evil undead the evil undead's territory. Yeah, they are sought out by the party to help them navigate in the evil undead's territory and attempt to locate and infiltrate the evil castle. Which is excellent. That means we can cover the rogue archetype, the trap dismantler and puzzle solver and all that kind of nonsense, but with a different character than the Gravekeeper's snarky, kind of immoral kind of character. Essentially, we can have our cake and eat it too. We get the tropes, the skill sets expected of a regular hero's party, but we switch around which characters have which personalities and which skill sets in a kind of new and more interesting mesh. I'm sure it's not entirely unique and that other people have done this, but you don't have to be unique. I know there's this idea of like there's nothing original under the sun. I strongly disagree. I think being derived or inspired from something does not make something unoriginal. As a matter of fact, I think it's harder to be completely unoriginal than it is to be at least a little bit original. I think unless you're full on straight up ripping something off, you're always going to put a little bit of your own spin on it. And I think even if you are copying something very closely, that's not necessarily an issue, because a lot of people want more of the same of what they already like. Especially within certain genres or within like fanfic writing and stuff like that. And even then, more of the same is never going to be more of exactly the same. As someone who reads fanfic and who loves to go through like certain specific tags, I never get tired of more of my tags, because it's always something different. Even two people in the same kind of tags answering the same prompt are going to present you two different stories, two different takes, examples of it, and they're both going to be worth reading. So even if something is not quote-unquote original, I think it can still be good. and I think it's often more original than people are willing to give it credit for. With all of that being said, I think here is probably a pretty good place to call the stream for today. I don't want to get into a whole second section of world building more of this. I did want to just round out a little bit towards the end of the stream with a little extra content. What we can do now is we can have a look if there's anyone to raid. See if there's anyone that I know live, or see if there's anyone doing similar content. That being said, doing similar content is unlikely because I've actually been struggling to find people who make writing and world building content. It's just not all that common. I was hoping to get to know a few more people in the community kind of and see what they've got going on, but it just hasn't quite worked out. Let's see, can I search for the writing tag and find anyone that way? Yeah, there's a few channels live. The writing tag seems to be a lot of people doing like writing sprints, you know, it's basically some way to sit down and get some motivation to do your own writing because you're watching somebody else also do writing, which I think is very good and useful, but it's not quite the same sort of thing that I'm doing. Okay, well, Era's live, and Era's great. Currently playing Warframe. So let's head on over to them. Era, absolute mad lad, been live for 6 hours now, not showing any signs of slowing down. I do hope you've enjoyed today's stream from me, and I hope you also enjoy Era's stream. They're very lovely. Do say hi to them for me. And we will be back tomorrow with... what did I schedule? We'll be back tomorrow with Book of Hours. Lovely little game. Lots of very interesting world building in there. Of the people who made Cultist Simulator. So it does have a little bit of that Eldritch vibe going on. So as far as horror world building is concerned, there's a very good source to take some inspiration from. I do hope I'll see you again then. Goodbye.